Consider the story of our past, not as a book of facts, but as a grand and shadowed stage. Is the history we've been taught to revere the unvarnished truth, or is it merely a performance, a spectacle crafted from the threads of power, victory, and fear? How many libraries of wisdom have been sacrificed to the flames to safeguard the fragile pride of a conqueror? How many maps charting unknown lands? How many statues bearing unfamiliar faces? How many sacred texts that whispered of different gods have been quietly ushered into oblivion because they posed questions too inconvenient to answer? If those lost pieces were ever restored, our understanding of ourselves might not just change, it might shatter. This is not a descent into the shallow waters of conspiracy. This is a voyage into the undeniable voids of history, into those moments when the truth was not lost, but taken, when our shared story was deliberately edited to serve a new order. There's a profound paradox that few dare to speak aloud. History is not simply the chronicle of what occurred. It is the chronicle of what was permitted to be remembered. From the very first empires that rose from the dust, the privilege of shaping memory has been the ultimate currency of power. Emperors, high priests, and dynasties did not only erect monuments to their glory. They raised the libraries of their rivals. They chiseled names from stone. They meticulously erased their predecessors from the ledger of time. This was no careless forgetting. It was a silent, methodical campaign of destruction, waged with a force more enduring than any sword. When a civilization falls, we see the broken walls and the scorched earth. But what truly burns first is memory. A single vanished manuscript can sever a line of understanding that stretches back 1,000 years. A single altered timeline can obliterate the heritage of an entire people. And a single story, branded as heresy, becomes a ghost, surviving only as a tremor in the darkness. Some of these wounds are too vast to conceal, like the scarlet glow of Alexandria's library against the night sky, or the sealed archives deep within the Vatican's stone heart. But other scars are subtler. A research paper that is never published. An ancient map brushed aside as a work of fantasy. An archaeological query quietly excised from a curriculum to sidestep controversy. With every such act, the narrative of our past bends just a little more. We are raised to believe in a clear, linear progression of events, a chain of history that is absolute and unchanging. But the truth is a tangled, contradictory wilderness teeming with shadows. And it is the silence surrounding those shadows that should unnerve us the most. Because when no one dares to ask what has been concealed, the wardens of memory no longer need to burn any books. They need only wait for the next generation to forget that another story was ever possible. So ask yourself, who holds the pen that writes the history our world is commanded to believe? Are you prepared? For once this door is opened, you will never see the past in the same light again. When we conjure the image of the Library of Alexandria, we envision a vast sanctuary of human thought, a living mind where countless papyrus scrolls held the wisdom of the ancient world. Here were the secrets of the stars, the geographies of distant lands, the arts of medicine, the depths of philosophy, and legends gathered from every shore touched by Greek and Roman influence. Historians estimate that at its zenith, the library contained over 700,000 scrolls, a staggering collection for its time. But what truly haunts the modern imagination is not the scale of its collection, but the mysterious and agonizing manner of its death. The burning of Alexandria's library has become a symbol of an incalculable loss, not merely of ink on parchment, but of entire worlds of knowledge ripped from the grasp of future generations. Surviving accounts tell us the first blow came around 48 BCE during Julius Caesar's siege of the city. A fire started in the harbor, leaped to the shore, and consumed tens of thousands of scrolls in nearby storehouses. But this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a slow, creeping demise. Over centuries, successive calamities, Aurelian's invasion, Theophilus's decree against paganism, and finally the Arab conquest, each acted like a wave, eroding more of the library's foundation until little remained. Yet, many contemporary scholars believe these were not just random accidents of war. A more unsettling theory suggests a deliberate, systematic campaign to purge pluralistic knowledge that challenged the absolute authority of gods and kings, that questioned the origin myths of ascended faiths. Why, they ask, were so many singular manuscripts from Egypt, Persia, and lands far beyond the Mediterranean all gathered in one place? And why did they all seem to vanish in unison? Was it pure coincidence that as the Roman Empire waned, Christian patriarchs saw the preservation of pagan philosophy as a direct threat to their power, a weed that had to be uprooted? Indirect evidence, gleaned from the sorrowful letters of Alexandrian scholars, hints that some scrolls may have been spirited away before the fires, smuggled out to be hidden in secret sanctuaries. But their destinations remain a mystery. Other theories propose a more sinister triage, that the most dangerous works, those that questioned political or religious dogma, were deliberately destroyed first. Only then were the flames permitted to consume the rest, erasing both the knowledge and the evidence of its censorship in one final, terrible blaze. You could imagine the library as a mirror, one that reflected the world with a clarity that those in power could not bear. Within its walls were alternative creation stories, cosmic models that did not place humanity at the center, and histories of civilizations that flourished without a single unifying God. Had these works survived, the story of humanity might have been a rich, sprawling epic of countless ideas, not a neat, linear tale of chosen empires. All that is left are fragments, scattered quotations, and the lamentations of scholars mourning a world of lost thought. Centuries have passed, but the debate still smolders. Was it a tragic accident, a stray spark in the chaos of battle? Or was it a veiled operation, a calculated cleansing of collective memory to make way for a new, singular truth? That question hangs in the air, a vast and empty space where pages of history once stood. In the shadow of Alexandria's tragic decline, few remember that in another corner of the Hellenistic world, a second great library rose to challenge its supremacy: Pergamum. Perched atop a windswept hill in Anatolia, Pergamum was not just the capital of a kingdom, but a blazing center of culture, where the thirst for knowledge was a consuming ambition. At its peak, the library of Pergamum held over 200,000 scrolls, second only to its Egyptian rival. The historian Pliny the Elder wrote that the kings of Pergamum sent agents across the known world to purchase or copy any manuscript they could find, treating every scrap of parchment as a treasure more precious than gold. This ambition, however, ignited a quiet but ferocious rivalry, what some scholars now call the Library Wars. The geographer Strabo recounts that Egypt's Ptolemaic dynasty, in an attempt to stifle Pergamum's growth, banned the export of papyrus. Cut off from their primary writing material, the scholars of Pergamum innovated, perfecting the use of pergamena, or parchment, made from treated animal skins. In turn, Pergamum aggressively hunted for rare texts, especially those Alexandria had not yet claimed. This was no mere academic squabble. It was a battle for intellectual dominance. Whoever controlled the world's greatest repository of knowledge held the power to shape thought across civilizations. But Pergamum's golden era began to fade as the shadow of Rome fell across Asia Minor. In 133 BCE, upon the death of its last king, the entire kingdom was bequeathed to the Roman Republic. And just before this transfer of power, something peculiar occurred. A vast portion of Pergamum's most treasured manuscripts simply vanished. According to accounts by Plutarch and other scattered sources, countless scrolls were either removed under the cover of darkness or destroyed. The most common theory is that this was an intentional act of cultural defiance, a scorched earth policy designed to deny Rome the intellectual capital of its new territory. Others suggest a more insidious possibility, that Roman envoys themselves orchestrated the removal, transferring the works to consolidate all knowledge under their own control, either in Rome or in Alexandria, which by then was also under their influence. Whatever the motive, the outcome was the same. A huge part of Pergamum's intellectual heart was ripped out. Catalogs disappeared. Original works by philosophers, physicians, and historians vanished from the historical record. In the shifting tides of empire, knowledge became a silent casualty, its legacy not just lost, but absorbed and rewritten by others who now had the power to decide what would be preserved and what would be left to rot. One modern scholar observed, if Alexandria was a treasure incinerated, Pergamum was a treasure dismantled, piece by piece, until only the cold stone walls remained in that chilling silence. It becomes impossible to distinguish what was lost to the gentle decay of time from what was deliberately erased in the service of power. If the theories hold true, the quiet purge of Pergamum's library was a strategy to ensure that future generations would never encounter the uncensored stories, the ones that might have challenged the official history that was about to be written. And this leaves us with a haunting question. How many times has knowledge been buried not because it was worthless, but because it was too dangerous for a new world order to tolerate? As the great repositories of Greco-Roman knowledge in Alexandria and Pergamum faded, our focus shifts eastward to another immense and profound body of wisdom, the early Buddhist manuscripts of ancient India. Starting in the 3rd century BCE, under the patronage of Emperor Ashoka and the Mauryan Empire, Buddhist teachings were painstakingly compiled and spread across the subcontinent. Monks and scholars carried these sacred texts, recorded on palm leaves, bark paper, or carved into stone, to great monastic universities like Nalanda, Vikramashala, and Odanapuri. For centuries, these institutions were believed to house the most complete and unaltered collections of the Buddha's original teachings, retaining a depth and nuance that would later be lost in translation. And yet, today, the vast majority of these original manuscripts are gone. Scholars contend that this immense loss cannot be attributed solely to the ravages of time or climate. A more violent explanation emerges in the 12th century, when Turkic and Afghan forces swept through the region, leaving a trail of destruction. Monasteries were sacked, their libraries burned to the ground, and their monks either slaughtered or forced to flee for their lives. The 13th century Persian historian Minhaj-i-Siraj described the obliteration of Nalanda not merely as an act of war, but as a systematic effort to eradicate Buddhist intellectual life, which was seen as a barrier to Islamization. He wrote that the fires that consumed Nalanda's library burned for 3 months, and travelers from miles away could smell the scent of burning parchment on the wind. But what is even more puzzling to modern researchers is the strange silence surrounding the manuscripts that monks might have smuggled to safety. Legends speak of desperate efforts to preserve the Dharma, with monks fleeing eastward into the high mountains of Nepal, Bhutan, and Tibet, their precious scrolls hidden in their robes. Others whisper of texts concealed in remote Himalayan caves, awaiting a time when they could safely re-emerge. Yet centuries have passed, and no definitive evidence has surfaced to confirm that these original manuscripts were ever recovered. What we are left with today are largely later copies, heavily edited, translated into Chinese or Tibetan, and reinterpreted through the lenses of different schools of thought. As a result, we can no longer be certain which versions reflect the Buddha's earliest teachings and which have been subtly reshaped by time, translation, and politics. Some historians argue that the loss of this knowledge was not just a consequence of invasion, but also of internal rivalries. As new dynasties rose and fell, they favored certain Buddhist schools over others. Philosophical critiques or commentaries that challenged the prevailing orthodoxy were often deemed divisive and deliberately excluded from large-scale copying projects. The transmission of these teachings was never a neutral act. It was sculpted by the forces of power. No one could say how much truth was quietly trimmed away, even while the scrolls rested safely on monastery shelves. This quiet disappearance has left a profound void in our understanding. Had the original manuscript survived, we might have a far richer picture of early Buddhist thought, perhaps with deeper connections to pre-Vedic philosophies. Today, archaeologists still unearth the ruins of Nalanda and Vikramashala, finding the stone pedestals that once supported vast libraries. But the words themselves, the subtle insights, have vanished. Their absence hints not just at neglect, but at a strategic erasure of memory, performed so quietly that no one can name the hand that lit the first flame. Like Alexandria and Pergamum, the story of India's lost Buddhist manuscripts is not just a tragedy of knowledge destroyed. It's a reminder that we are left with a haunting question. Were those scriptures truly turned to ash? Or are they still out there, sleeping in some forgotten mountain sanctuary, waiting for a time when humanity is ready to face its complete self? If the losses at Alexandria, Pergamum, and the Buddhist monasteries were casualties of war and covert campaigns, ancient China bore witness to something far more terrifying: a state-sponsored, publicly declared, and meticulously recorded purge of knowledge. This was the infamous burning of the books and burying of the scholars under Emperor Qin Shi Huang. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was one of the most methodical and brutal attempts to erase a people's collective memory ever undertaken. According to the records of the great historian Sima Qian, the decree was issued in 213 BCE, shortly after the Qin dynasty had unified the warring states into a single, monolithic empire. The official goal was to unify thought and eliminate dissent. But many scholars today see it as a calculated strategy to sever all ties to the past, suppressing any intellectual tradition that could challenge the emperor's absolute authority. The purge began at the recommendation of Prime Minister Li Si, a fervent legalist who believed that conformity was the bedrock of order. Li Si argued that scholars, particularly Confucians, were using histories of the former kingdoms to cast doubt on the legitimacy of Qin rule. His edict was swift and merciless. With the exception of texts on agriculture, medicine, and divination, all historical records, poems, and philosophical works from the old kingdoms were to be surrendered and destroyed. Anyone caught hiding these forbidden texts faced execution. Within months, an immense collection of bamboo slips and scrolls was gathered in the capital and set ablaze in massive bonfires at the imperial court. In those flames, it was not just ink and parchment that turned to ash. It was the intellectual soul of centuries. Philosophies of virtue, chronicles of fallen dynasties, meditations on humanity, all were consumed so that history could be rewritten from a single, imperial perspective. Some accounts say the sky above the capital glowed red for miles as scholars watched in helpless silence, knowing that to speak out was to invite death. A year later, a second, even darker act followed: the mass execution of hundreds of scholars, reputedly buried alive as a chilling warning against any form of dissent. However, some modern historians caution that the records of this event, written by the subsequent Han Dynasty, may have exaggerated the scale of the purge as propaganda to demonize the Qin and legitimize their own rule. Archaeological discoveries have indeed confirmed that some texts survived, hidden away in remote provinces. Yet, even if the accounts were embellished, the terrifying truth remains. The Qin dynasty established a precedent where centralized power claimed the right to determine which knowledge was permitted to exist. What sets this event apart is its chilling frankness. There was no pretense of religious purity or accidental fire. The regime openly declared that intellectual diversity was a threat to the state. An empire that built the Great Wall also planted a seed of profound instability. For no order founded on forced forgetting can ever be truly secure. Today, as archaeologists sift through the ruins and study the few surviving bamboo slips, questions linger. How many schools of thought were utterly extinguished? How much ancient wisdom on governance, ethics, and the cosmos was lost forever? Did those flames truly suppress dissent, or did they ignite a deeper longing in future generations to reclaim a stolen past? The Qin book burning stands as a stark testament to a recurring pattern in history. When power reaches its zenith, it seeks to conquer not just land, but memory itself. And from the ashes of those bonfires, a question still rises. What else remains buried in the shadows? waiting to reveal the true foundations of an empire. After the inferno at Xianyang consumed the memory of ancient China, history witnessed another cultural tragedy, this time across the ocean, amidst the stone pyramids and dense jungles of the Maya civilization. Few people realize that Mesoamerica was once home to thousands of intricate manuscripts known as codices, fashioned from bark paper, coated in white lime, and inscribed with one of the most sophisticated hieroglyphic systems ever created. Each codex was a universe of knowledge. They contained not just religious doctrine, but advanced astronomy, complex mathematics, precise calendrical systems, and the dynastic histories of kings, a vast library of wisdom developed over centuries. Today, we can only glimpse a fraction of what was lost. When Spanish conquistadors swept through the Yucatan Peninsula in the 16th century, the fate of this knowledge was sealed. In the name of evangelization and colonial power, the Spanish clergy declared the Maya manuscripts to be works of the devil. The most infamous act of this cultural destruction occurred in 1562 when Bishop Diego de Landa ordered a massive book burning in the town of Mani. In his own chillingly detached account, Relation de las Cosas de Yucatan, de Landa described how he gathered every Maya codex he could find and set them ablaze in a public ceremony, convinced he was destroying demonic lies. Centuries of accumulated wisdom, preserved on delicate bark paper, were reduced to ash as Maya elders and scribes were tortured to confess their sacred beliefs. The ultimate irony is that Diego de Landa, the man responsible for this irreparable loss, also left behind the most detailed record of the Maya writing system, a paradox that continues to haunt scholars. It was his work that, centuries later, provided the key to begin deciphering the script. But without the original codices, there is simply not enough material to fully reconstruct their knowledge. Out of what may have been thousands of manuscripts, only 4 are known to have survived: the Dresden, Madrid, Paris, and Grolier codices. All are now held in European museums, a stark reminder that the intellectual heritage of the Maya no longer belongs to the descendants of its creators. Many modern historians argue that this was not merely an act of religious zeal, but a deliberate strategy of cultural erasure. By forcing the Maya to convert, the colonizers stripped them not only of their gods, but also of their written history, their ancestry, and their claims to the land. In the brutal calculus of colonization, knowledge is power, and controlling history means controlling identity. The burning of the codices was therefore not just symbolic. It was strategic, designed to hollow out a civilization from the inside. Today, as we walk through the magnificent ruins of Palenque, Copan, or Tikal, it is impossible not to feel the weight of what is missing. Advanced astronomical charts, royal epics, formulas for predicting eclipses, all vanished in the smoke. Researchers may never fully grasp the depth of Maya science and philosophy. Each codex destroyed was a piece of a puzzle we can never complete. And here lies the final, bitter paradox. To rebuild Maya history, we must rely on the records of the very man who ordered its destruction. With all his biases, de Landa left behind a key, but the library it was meant to unlock has been turned to ash, its secrets silenced forever. Was the fire at Mani simply an inevitable clash of faiths? Or was it a calculated act to ensure that Maya knowledge could never again challenge the colonial narrative? And if that fire had never been lit, would we see the history of the Americas through clearer, less distorted eyes? After the fires that consumed the Maya codices, the story of erased knowledge leads us back across the ocean to a text that was once cherished by early Jewish and Christian communities, only to be abruptly purged from the official biblical canon. This is the tale of the Book of Enoch, a manuscript both deeply revered and fiercely condemned. According to tradition, Enoch was the 7th patriarch after Adam, a man so righteous that he walked with God and was taken into the heavens without tasting death. But what makes the Book of Enoch so remarkable is not just its mythic grandeur, but the radical cosmic and theological ideas it contains. ideas that clashed violently with the doctrines that would later define organized religion. The text, composed of several parts including the famous Book of the Watchers, tells of a group of angels, the Watchers, who descended to earth and, succumbing to temptation, taught humanity forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, astronomy, magic, and the arts of war. This, the book claims, unleashed an age of corruption that culminated in the Great Flood. These narratives pose deeply unsettling questions for religious authorities. If God's plan was singular and absolute, how could rogue angels act independently, bestowing sacred knowledge upon humanity? And if humanity was punished for receiving this knowledge, where was the line between divine wisdom and forbidden sin? For the first few centuries of the Common Era, the Book of Enoch was widely read. It was treasured by communities like the Essenes at Qumran, and fragments of it were even quoted in the New Testament. The Epistle of Jude directly cites a prophecy from Enoch, signaling its once prominent status. But by the 4th century, at the great councils where the biblical canon was formalized, the book was officially excluded, deemed heretical and of dubious origin. From that moment, copying or distributing the text was forbidden. In the Latin and Greek Christian world, it all but vanished, fading into obscurity. Only the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church continued to preserve it as part of their scripture. To the rest of Christendom, Enoch became a dangerous, apocryphal work. For over 1,500 years, European scholars knew of it only through vague and hostile references. Then, in the 18th century, the Scottish explorer James Bruce returned from Ethiopia with several handwritten copies. The discovery sent shockwaves through the academic world, offering the first complete glimpse into a text filled with elaborate cosmologies, angelic hierarchies, and a vision of the supernatural that had been deliberately suppressed. Some scholars argue this suppression was not just a theological disagreement, but a strategic move to centralize religious authority. As the Church sought to establish a single, unshakable dogma, texts that spoke of rogue spiritual forces or forbidden knowledge posed a direct threat. If wisdom could be imparted to humanity from sources outside of God's direct will, the Church's claim as the exclusive gatekeeper of salvation would weaken. In this light, the Book of Enoch had to disappear. Today, as we study the surviving text, we can hear echoes of older Babylonian and Egyptian mysticism, suggesting it may have been a bridge between ancient wisdom traditions that were long ago severed. And the questions remain. How many other versions of this book once existed? And most importantly, if the Book of Enoch had never been suppressed, would our understanding of religious history be fundamentally different? The long silence surrounding Enoch is proof that not all knowledge is lost in fire. Some is buried in darkness, sealed away by those with the power to define what is true. If the disappearance of the Book of Enoch represents wisdom buried in silence, the story of the Gnostic texts is one of far more overt and organized suppression, a deliberate campaign to annihilate an entire spiritual tradition in the name of protecting a single orthodox faith. Gnosticism flourished in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE as communities from Egypt to Asia Minor began to explore radically different interpretations of the divine, the universe, and the human soul. These ideas stood in stark opposition to the emerging doctrines of the early Christian church. For the Gnostics, the material world was not a perfect creation but a flawed prison, crafted by a lesser, ignorant deity known as the demiurge. They believed the human soul was a divine spark trapped in a body of flesh, and only through gnosis, a secret, mystical knowledge, could it escape and ascend to a higher spiritual realm. To the leaders of the early church, this was not just heresy, it was a profound theological threat. If salvation could be achieved from within, without the need for the church's sacraments or priests, the entire institutional foundation of its authority would crumble. Gnostic gospels and dialogues, many believed to be the secret teachings of Jesus himself, circulated among close-knit communities, meticulously copied onto papyrus scrolls. The Gnostic library was vast and included works like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Apocalypse of Adam. The Gospel of Thomas was particularly subversive, famously declaring that the kingdom of God is not in the sky, but within each person, accessible without any mediator. By the late 2nd century, church fathers like Irenaeus recognized the growing influence of these texts and launched a fierce campaign to stamp them out. Gnostic writings were condemned as forgeries, and anyone caught possessing them faced excommunication or worse. Over the centuries, nearly all of these manuscripts were systematically seized and destroyed. The campaign was so devastatingly effective that for over a millennium, all that was known of Gnosticism came from the hostile polemics of its enemies. That all changed dramatically in 1945 when a farmer stumbled upon a sealed clay jar near Nag Hammadi in Egypt. Inside were 13 papyrus codices containing more than 50 Gnostic texts, preserved in the dry desert air for centuries. This was the legendary Nag Hammadi Library. When translated, these texts unveiled a rich, metaphysical cosmos, a universe of light and shadow, where human souls were divine exiles and earthly institutions, including organized religion, were seen as prisons for the spirit. This discovery revolutionized our understanding of early Christianity, revealing it not as a single, monolithic faith, but as a vibrant chorus of competing voices before one was declared orthodox. It is true that many Gnostic groups were themselves exclusive, claiming sole access to the truth. But one fact is undeniable. For more than 1,000 years, to preserve these writings was to risk one's life. Today, as the Nag Hammadi texts are freely studied, a profound question emerges. If these Gospels had not been destroyed, would Christian history have unfolded as a single, linear path or as a rich tapestry of interwoven truths? The Church's willingness to banish dozens of spiritual works demonstrates that religious authority has often been built not just by preaching a message, but by controlling memory itself, deciding what is allowed to be remembered. And the Gnostic story leaves us with a question that echoes through time. Were these scribes and their Gospels hunted down to protect a faith or to protect its power? If the Gnostic texts reveal a campaign to suppress a rival spirituality, the fate of Babylon's lost writings exposes a different kind of erasure, one where vast archives of ancient knowledge vanish into an abyss of institutional silence, a silence that persists to this day. Babylon, the legendary metropolis on the Euphrates, was once the intellectual beacon of Mesopotamia. For millennia, its scholars inscribed countless clay tablets with knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and myth. During the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, the city's royal libraries and temple archives were said to hold the oldest versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, detailed dynastic chronicles stretching back to the dawn of Sumerian civilization, and astronomical records of unparalleled precision. Over time, as empires rose and fell, many of these records were scattered, taken as spoils of war by Persians and Greeks. And yet, it is believed that huge caches of tablets remained, sealed in hidden chambers beneath the city's ruins. In the 19th century, when European expeditions began excavating the site, a strange pattern of inconsistency emerged. Archaeologists like Hormizd Rassam and Robert Coldway documented the recovery of thousands of clay tablets, so many, in fact, that they could not be cataloged on site. Early reports from the digs hinted at the discovery of previously unknown king lists and chronicles, detailing dynasties and events that did not fit with the accepted timeline of Mesopotamian history. According to some independent researchers, these inconvenient texts began to quietly disappear. They were either relegated to the uncatalogued backrooms of the British Museum and Berlin's Pergamon Museum, or they were sold off into private collections, their contents never fully disclosed. Part of the controversy arises from the persistent refusal of some institutions to release or even acknowledge certain materials. Countless tablets were generically labeled as administrative records or commercial receipts, with no photographs or translations ever made public. While modern Assyriologists often cite a lack of resources to translate the overwhelming number of tablets, skeptics ask a pointed question. If these are merely routine ledgers, why the enduring secrecy? Could some of them contain historical or astronomical information that would force a radical rewriting of our foundational understanding of civilization? The mystery deepens with persistent reports of uncatalogued Babylonian tablets surfacing at private auctions, only to vanish again into the vaults of anonymous collectors. In recent years, a few fragments have re-emerged through legal disputes, revealing previously unknown rituals and startlingly detailed accounts of celestial cycles that rivaled or even predated discoveries once thought to be modern. In a world that prides itself on archaeological transparency, the silence surrounding many of Babylon's texts is deafening. Some scholars have even coined a term for this phenomenon, the academic gray zone, a limbo where artifacts exist but are officially unnamed, unpublished, and inaccessible. Within this zone, speculation thrives, ranging from simple bureaucratic incompetence to a deliberate, protective suppression of findings that could destabilize the carefully constructed historical narrative of the last century. Today, as we contemplate the ruins of Babylon, a question remains. If these ancient records were ever fully translated and revealed, how much of our accepted prehistory would have to be rewritten? Is the long silence merely a byproduct of chaotic 19th century excavation? Or is it evidence of a quiet effort to preserve a familiar story by withholding truths that refuse to fit? After the debates surrounding Babylon's lost tablets, our journey leads to another extraordinary find, this time not in a royal archive, but in a dry cave overlooking the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956, are famous for containing the oldest known manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible. But among the hundreds of fragile parchment scrolls, one object stood apart, unique and utterly baffling. A scroll made not of paper, but of metal. This is the Copper Scroll. Unlike the other texts, which are theological or legal in nature, the Copper Scroll is a starkly practical document. It is a list, an inventory of approximately 60 secret locations where staggering quantities of gold, silver, and other precious items were supposedly buried. The text details hiding spots in caves, underground chambers, and ruins scattered across the Judean wilderness, with a total treasure estimated to be worth dozens of tons of precious metals, a hoard so vast it confounds even the most skeptical archaeologists. From a moment it was found in 1952, the Copper Scroll has been a source of intense controversy. So heavily oxidized it could not be unrolled. It had to be painstakingly cut into segments to be read. In 1956, the lead researcher released the first translation, confirming it was a literal list of hidden treasure. And yet, in the decades since, no major, official archaeological expedition, not by Israel, Jordan, or any international institution, has ever publicly attempted to locate the treasure it describes. The scholarly world remains sharply divided. Some insist the scroll is purely symbolic, a work of religious allegory. Others, like the late archaeologist Vendell Jones, were convinced it was a real inventory, perhaps detailing the temple treasures hidden by Jewish priests just before the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. There have been whispers of quiet, unofficial investigations at some of the sites, but the findings have never been disclosed. This raises a deeply troubling question. If the scroll is merely a metaphor, why was it engraved on copper, an expensive and durable material reserved only for the most important documents? And if a treasure worth billions of dollars is real, what has prevented governments from searching for it? Some theories suggest that finding the treasure would ignite an unmanageable firestorm of religious and political disputes over ownership and sovereignty, particularly concerning Jerusalem. Others propose a more cynical explanation, finding nothing, or worse, finding evidence that the treasure was looted long ago would diminish the mythic power of the Dead Sea Scrolls as a whole. And as history repeatedly shows, mystery is often more valuable than a disappointing truth. Today, the original Copper Scroll rests in a museum in Jordan, its secrets intact. The locations it describes, from the tomb in the Valley of Acre to a cave marked by 2 stone pillars, remain officially unexcavated. Among archaeologists, it is an open secret that the topic is too sensitive to touch, not just because of the money, but because it strikes at the heart of historical and theological claims in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. The story of the Copper Scroll thus becomes another powerful symbol of how knowledge can be suppressed, not by fire or censorship, but by a quiet, coordinated silence among those who fear what the truth might unleash. And we are left with that familiar question: will this fragment of the past ever be allowed to shatter the fog of legend? Or will its truth remain sealed away, buried under the dust of closed archives? From a mystery of the Copper Scroll and its untouched treasure, our history leads us to one of its most persistent and debated legends: the reports of giant human skeletons unearthed across North America, only to vanish under deeply puzzling circumstances. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, dozens of local newspapers, town records, and even established journals like Scientific American and the New York Times carried stunning accounts of these discoveries. The reports described human remains measuring between 8 and 10 feet in height, often found in burial mounds alongside intricate weapons, jewelry, and other artifacts. In 1877, a tomb in Nevada was said to have yielded a giant skeleton. In 1891, massive bones were allegedly unearthed at the Cahokia Mounds in Illinois. Similar stories emerged from the Ohio Valley and across the Midwest, painting a tantalizing picture of a forgotten race of giants. What complicates this story is the recurring involvement of one of America's most revered scientific bodies, the Smithsonian Institution. According to numerous local accounts, Smithsonian representatives were often dispatched to take custody of these anomalous remains for further study. But strangely, despite the initial media excitement, none of these skeletons ever went on public display. No official reports were ever published. Over time, they simply disappeared from the record, their existence relegated to aging newspaper clippings and the oral traditions of the towns where they were found. This lack of transparency fueled a host of theories. Many have claimed that the Smithsonian and perhaps other official institutions deliberately destroyed the remains because they contradicted the established anthropological narrative, which has no place for a parallel race of giants in North America's prehistory. In 2014, a viral article alleged that the Smithsonian had been forced to admit to this destruction, a story the institution swiftly and firmly denounced as a hoax. Yet, for skeptics, a denial is not the same as a transparent accounting. They argue that within the vast, underfunded archives of large museums, countless artifacts have been lost, misfiled, or left uncatalogued for decades. Independent historians suggest that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as modern anthropology and evolutionary theory were taking shape, any discovery that disrupted the neat, emerging picture of human development would have been quietly dismissed or deemed unreliable. The image of the giant skeleton has thus become a symbol of the murky territory where folklore collides with the institutional control of knowledge. This is made even more compelling by the fact that many Native American traditions, from the Iroquois to the Choctaw, contain legends of a race of red-haired giants who once roamed the land. When reports of enormous skeletons surface in the very regions described by these myths, the line between history and collective imagination grows tantalizingly thin. Today, the great mounds of the American Midwest still stand as silent monuments, and local museums occasionally display oversized tools or unusually thick bone fragments. But no complete skeleton has ever been officially verified and made available for open academic study. This absence of proof only deepens the mystery, fueling both suspicion and fascination. And like the Copper Scroll, it leads us back to a familiar question. Was the disappearance of this evidence simply a chaotic byproduct of early, unsystematic archaeology? Or was it part of a conscious effort to keep the story of human history neatly confined within its accepted boundaries? In the quiet spaces between these questions, the mounds themselves stand like anonymous tombstones, daring us to dig deeper, even if we are not ready for what we might unearth. Following the tales of missing giant skeletons and allegations of destroyed evidence, The issue of controlling archaeological knowledge becomes even more pronounced when we examine the fate of countless excavation reports from the 19th and 20th centuries, reports that have quietly vanished from public view. During the golden age of modern archaeology, from the late 1800s to the 1930s, expeditions funded by major museums and societies in Britain, France, Germany, and the United States fanned out across the globe. These missions produced a wealth of detailed documentation, including field notes, drawings, and thousands of photographs. For a time, many of these reports were accessible in academic libraries. But strangely, by the mid-20th century, particularly after World War II, a significant number of them were pulled from circulation or disappeared from public catalogs under vague justifications like archive reorganization. A frequently cited example involves British missions to Iraq between the 1920s and 1930s. Their reports described layered sites at Nineveh and Kish, with artifacts whose dating seemed to conflict with established chronologies. Even T. E. Lawrence of Lawrence of Arabia fame noted that certain tablets with puzzling inscriptions were quietly packed away, deemed too problematic to explain. By the 1950s, many of these initial reports could no longer be found in the British Museum's library catalog and have never been republished in full. A similar pattern emerged with reports on the Cahokia and Etowah mounds in the United States. Early documents from the late 19th century described structures and artifacts suggesting a far more complex indigenous civilization than was permissible within the prevailing narrative of the time. According to some researchers, by the 1930s, these original records were recalled for correction of errors, yet the corrected versions were never released. Historians who later tried to access the originals were told the files were lost or unavailable. In France, early 20th century expeditions in Southeast Asia documented inscriptions and symbols at sites like Angkor that could have forced a re-evaluation of the region's historical timeline. But by the 1970s, citing the need for preservation amid regional conflicts, many of these archive boxes were sealed. Decades later, only a fraction of this material has been declassified. These cases raise an unsettling question. Why would supposedly neutral academic documents disappear from public access so easily? Is it possible that inconvenient data, findings that contradict well-established historical models, have been quietly withdrawn to maintain a theoretical consensus? Some scholars propose a more benign explanation, blaming bureaucratic chaos and underfunded archives. But for those who have personally requested access only to be met with the same scripted responses, politically sensitive, pending verification, awaiting review, such explanations ring hollow. Behind those closed archive doors may lie nothing more than unremarkable field notes, or they may hold evidence powerful enough to destabilize our entire understanding of human civilization. When access to primary data is controlled by a select few, the public is left with a sanitized version of history, clean, cohesive, and stripped of its complexities. The disappearance of these reports never ignited a major scandal. There is no lost gold, no dramatic discovery, only a creeping silence and the growing void it leaves behind. But that silence prompts a final, pressing question. How many times in modern history have original documents been removed, not for preservation, but simply to prevent a new generation from seeing a version of the truth too inconvenient to accept? After stories of vanishing archaeological records, our journey returns to a place so iconic it has become almost invisible through overfamiliarity, the Giza Plateau. For centuries, the Great Pyramids have stood as silent, towering symbols of ancient power. But beneath the sun-bleached limestone of the Great Pyramid of Khufu lies another, hidden world, a labyrinth of shafts and subterranean chambers largely closed off to the public. The largest of these, known as the subterranean chamber, sits more than 30 meters below the pyramid's base. As early as the 19th century, explorers like Flinders Petrie documented its rough-hewn walls and a deep, mysterious pit that seemed to have no bottom. For decades, This underground world remained accessible to researchers and a few daring adventurers. But starting in the late 1990s, under the leadership of Zahi Hawass, Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities abruptly sealed off access to these lower chambers. The official reason given was the need for preservation and structural safety. Yet, perplexingly, the upper passages of the pyramid remained open to tourists. This selective closure immediately fueled suspicion. Independent researchers like Graham Hancock and Andrew Collins pointed to ground-penetrating radar surveys suggesting the existence of even larger, undocumented voids beneath the known chambers, possibly hidden ruins or caches of artifacts. The Scan Pyramids project, using advanced muography, later confirmed the presence of unexplained cavities within the structure, including a massive void not accounted for in any previous architectural plans. In response, Egyptian authorities denied any cover-up, insisting that all research was focused on preservation and that no sensational discoveries had been made. But the tightly controlled flow of information and repeated delays in granting new excavation permits left many wondering if something was being deliberately concealed. In ancient Egyptian cosmology, a pyramid was more than a tomb. It was a gateway to the afterlife, a machine for resurrection. Classical texts refer to underground chambers as the Hall of Trials, where the soul faced darkness before its rebirth. If these structures do contain evidence of early religious rites or lost texts, it is easy to understand why their disclosure could be a sensitive matter, capable of reshaping our entire understanding of ancient Egyptian theology. To this day, the only available images of the pyramid's deepest chambers are grainy, black-and-white photos from a bygone era or clandestine snapshots, taken before access was restricted. Official explanations continue to revolve around the familiar, hollow phrase. Further research is needed, yet it is precisely this silence, this vacuum of information, that suggests the truth has already been filtered, released only in carefully managed fragments. Standing on the sun-drenched Giza Plateau, it's easy to forget that just beneath your feet may lie chambers that no one has been allowed to fully explore. And the question lingers, what truly rests within that stone heart? A sacred archive? A ceremonial void? Or something else entirely? But more importantly, why, for decades, has the decision to open or close that door belonged to so few, while the rest of the world is left only to guess? After the tale of sealed chambers beneath Giza, our gaze shifts to the other side of the world, to the legendary waters of Lake Titicaca, the sacred cradle of Andean civilization. High in the mountains between Bolivia and Peru, this vast lake was, according to Inca myth, the birthplace of the sun's children, who founded an empire. For centuries, conquistadors heard legends of sunken stone cities hidden beneath its waves. But it wasn't until the turn of the 21st century that modern technology put those legends to the test. In 2000, a major international archaeological project sponsored by the Bolivian government and European institutions conducted deep-water sonar scans of the lakebed. The team's preliminary reports were stunning. They confirmed the existence of a massive submerged architectural complex with stone walls, stepped terraces, and monolithic columns, alongside a trove of ceramic artifacts and ritual objects. The discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Many speculated that the site was a major pre-Inca ceremonial center, perhaps linked to the Tiwanaku civilization. But certain details like the style of the stonework didn't quite match known Tiwanaku patterns, leading some to ask a daring question. Could these ruins predate Tiwanaku, hinting at an even older, forgotten culture? And then everything stopped. Just as the findings were gaining international attention, the project was abruptly suspended. All research was halted, with the official reasons cited as a lack of funding and concerns over cultural sensitivity. Requests from researchers, even those involved in the initial discovery, to access the recovered artifacts were denied. The project's data and documents were effectively sealed indefinitely. Independent archaeologists were baffled. The initial funding had been secured for years, and local communities had shown pride and willingness to collaborate, casting doubt on the official explanations. Suspicions began to grow. Could the ruins beneath the lake contain information so disruptive it would challenge the entire mainstream narrative of Andean civilization, perhaps even hinting at ancient transoceanic connections? Even if the cause was a simple internal conflict, it doesn't explain one central fact. In over 2 decades, no full sonar maps, detailed artifact inventories, or carbon dating results from the project have ever been made public. Only a handful of photographs and scattered press releases remain, just enough to confirm the site's existence, but not its age or nature. Today, as tourists cruise across the shimmering surface of Lake Titicaca, they are unaware that a lost chapter of human history may lie sleeping in the depths below. The stone walls are silent, and the records about them are locked away, with no indication of if or when they will ever be revealed. The question is no longer just who built those submerged structures, but what caused a major, publicly announced excavation to vanish from sight. From the sunken walls of Lake Titicaca, our journey now leads us to the remote and treacherous Bayanhar Mountains on the border of Tibet and China. It was here, in the late 1930s, that one of archaeology's most bizarre and controversial stories began, the story of the Dropa stones. According to scattered reports that emerged in the West decades later, the original expedition, led by a Chinese archaeologist, was exploring a system of high-altitude caves. Inside, they allegedly discovered a series of small tombs containing unusual skeletons with elongated skulls and frail bodies. But the most shocking find was over 700 circular stone discs, each with a hole in the center and covered in a spiral groove of tiny, unknown symbols. In 1962, a professor named Some Umnui, supposedly from the Beijing Academy of Ancient Studies, was said to have deciphered the discs. He claimed the symbols told the story of beings who had crash-landed in the mountains thousands of years ago. Their tale spoke of conflict and eventual intermingling with the native peoples. If true, the Dropa stones would represent one of the oldest recorded accounts of potential extraterrestrial contact. But then, a strange and total silence fell. Shortly after this information was allegedly translated and leaked, Professor Samamnui and his research vanished. His name could not be found in any official academic directory. The Beijing Academy denied any knowledge of the project. No peer-reviewed journal ever published his findings. Over time, the very existence of the expedition was called into question. Western scholars who pursued the story hit a wall of official silence. Skeptics have dismissed the entire affair as an elaborate hoax, pointing to the lack of verifiable sources. But others counter that no one has ever definitively proven it false, either. There has never been an official denial from Chinese authorities, only a complete and uniform absence of information. Some accounts claim a few of the Dropa stones were briefly displayed in a Chinese museum before being removed. Today, however, no verified specimens exist in any public collection. What makes the story so persistent is that the description of the discs, stone circles inscribed with symbolic texts, is consistent with ancient Tibetan traditions. Some ethnographers suggest the tale could be a fusion of real archaeology with local myths about starborn tribes. But even so, no one has explained why hundreds of finely crafted artifacts, if they were real, would leave behind no photographs, no detailed studies, and no institutional paper trail. Critics call it one of the great hoaxes of the 20th century. But for many, it is the vanishing of records and the deafening silence from official channels that remains the most suspicious part of the story. The Dropa stones are trapped in a paradoxical space, impossible to confirm, yet stubbornly difficult to disprove. And so the question still hangs in the thin mountain air. If the stones were a fabrication, why was the story never officially refuted? But if they were real, what was discovered on those discs that warranted a total information blackout, as if the entire event had never happened at all? From the vanishing Dropa stones, the trail leads us to a concept as fascinating as it is controversial. OO parts, or out-of-place artifacts, coined in the mid-20th century. The term refers to ancient objects whose technology material, or context seems radically inconsistent with the civilization that supposedly created them. What makes OOP arts such a sensitive topic is not just their challenge to established historical timelines, but the curious way they are handled by mainstream institutions. Many major museums have, at one time or another, briefly acknowledged or even displayed these anomalous items, only to quietly withdraw them later, labeling them unverified or consigning them to the indefinite purgatory of off-limits archives. One of the most famous examples is the Antikythera mechanism, a complex bronze device recovered from a shipwreck off the coast of Greece in 1901. For decades, its intricate system of gears baffled scholars. Only much later did modern imaging confirm it was an astonishingly sophisticated astronomical calculator, with a precision comparable to an 18th century clock. While it is proudly displayed today, for nearly half a century it was kept in storage, largely dismissed because it was simply too advanced for the known technological capabilities of the ancient Greeks. Another classic case is the Baghdad battery, a set of ceramic jars containing copper cylinders and signs of an acidic electrolyte, discovered in Iraq in 1936. Some have proposed they functioned as primitive galvanic cells, possibly for gold electroplating. Because this idea did not align with the accepted view of Parthian-era technology, the artifact sat largely ignored in the Baghdad Museum for decades, drawing attention only after it was featured in a Western publication. And there are countless others. The Klerksdorp spheres of South Africa, with their seemingly machine-etched grooves, the London hammer, found embedded in ancient sandstone, or pre-Columbian carvings that appear to depict flying machines. They all follow a familiar pattern: a brief burst of media attention, followed by a quiet withdrawal from public exhibition and reclassification as items of uncertain provenance. Skeptical archaeologists rightly argue that many OO parts are misdated, misunderstood, or even modern forgeries. But the paradox is this: instead of rigorously and publicly studying these objects to debunk them, institutions often choose silence. They remove them from catalogs, close the files, or simply refuse to discuss them. This silence is what feeds the suspicion that our technological history may be far more complex and non-linear than academic models allow. Today, as visitors wander through the pristine halls of the world's great museums, few are aware that deep in the storerooms below, hundreds of such inconvenient artifacts may lie untouched, not authenticated enough to be displayed, yet too intriguing to be discarded. They exist in a limbo of institutional denial. The story of OO parts is not necessarily one of conspiracy, but perhaps of a deep-seated institutional discomfort, a fear of destabilizing a system of knowledge that has been too long considered settled. Because if a 2,000-year-old gear mechanism or a ceramic battery from antiquity were ever definitively proven authentic, it would force us to rewrite the textbooks. And perhaps that is why these artifacts remain on the margins, reduced to black and white photos and unanswered questions. From the out-of-place artifacts gathering dust in museum basements, our story drifts to the East China Sea, to a submerged stone formation that has ignited a decades-long debate. This is Yonaguni, a sunken monument that is either one of the most important archaeological discoveries of our time or a stunning trick of nature. Located off Japan's westernmost island, Yonaguni burst into global consciousness in 1986 when a local diver stumbled upon a massive rock formation some 25 meters below the waves. The initial photographs were astonishing. The site appeared to be a series of near-perfect terraces with sharp, 90-degree angles, polished flat surfaces, and what looked like carved channels or corridors. A research team, led by Professor Masaaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus, began mapping the site. In his early reports, Kimura described Yonaguni as an enormous man-made complex, including a pyramid-like structure, ceremonial stairs, and even faint relief carvings. He cautiously proposed that it could be the ruins of a city submerged at the end of the last ice age, potentially over 10,000 years old. If true, this would shatter our understanding of East Asian prehistory, suggesting a civilization capable of large-scale stone engineering long before recorded history. But as media coverage surged, the official response from Japanese archaeological and geological institutions grew increasingly cold. Japan's Geological Society issued a formal statement declaring that Yonaguni was nothing more than naturally eroded sandstone. More curiously, Kimura's own research team began to withdraw from the international spotlight. By the early 2000s, funding for the project had dried up, and the team's full survey data was no longer being publicly updated. Independent researchers who attempted to investigate found that key information, like sonar imaging and 3D scans, had become difficult to obtain. Requests for new research were met with silence as mainstream Japanese academics distanced themselves from what was being derisively dubbed the Eastern Atlantis. Skeptics maintain that Yonaguni is a rare geological anomaly, a place where natural fractures and erosion have coincidentally mimicked architecture. But others ask a pointed question. If it is just a natural formation, why has so much of the original survey data been withheld? Why aren't the sonar maps published in peer-reviewed journals for open scrutiny? Today, you can still dive at Yonaguni and run your hands along the flat stone surfaces and trace the sharp corners beneath the turquoise waves. But you will be hard-pressed to find a complete, official report on the site. The story of Yonaguni raises a familiar question. Why was a major discovery first celebrated, then quietly buried in academic silence? Is it a fear of disrupting historical orthodoxy, or simply excessive caution in the face of a theory too bold to accept? And will Yonaguni remain a monument drowned by waves and silence? Or will someone one day be permitted to uncover its final truth? If Yonaguni raises doubts about the true age of ancient ruins, the story of medieval European architecture touches on something even more delicate. The possibility that historical timelines have been deliberately revised to create a more linear and less controversial narrative. Since the 19th century, when historians began systematically cataloging Europe's medieval churches and castles, they relied on two main sources: official church and royal records, and architectural analysis. But over time, subtle inconsistencies began to emerge. Across England, France, and Germany, several iconic sites were found to contain foundation stones or wall segments built with techniques that looked distinctly older, some even resembling Roman or pre-Roman construction. Great Gothic cathedrals like Chartres and Reims are prime examples. During 19th century restorations, architects noted foundations with Roman-style bricks and carvings, but these observations were often left as vague footnotes, never integrated into the official dating of the structures. This was often because the restoration projects were tightly controlled by the church and historical commissions, both of which had a vested interest in presenting medieval Christian Europe as the clear starting point of all grand architecture. In England, similar debates arose over structures like Dover Castle and the Tower of London, where subterranean chambers revealed mortar and stonework that looked suspiciously Roman. Early 20th century archaeologists even questioned whether many so-called Norman structures were actually built atop much older foundations, their timelines deliberately altered to legitimize newer dynasties. Such questions were frequently dismissed as speculation and excluded from academic journals. In Germany, Marburg Castle, a symbol of medieval military might, has long been dated to the 13th century. Yet, a 1972 survey using radiocarbon dating on its mortar yielded results that were several centuries older. The findings were labeled non-representative, and the official 13th century date remained unchanged. Some argue this is simply a matter of cultural layering. Medieval builders often repurposed Roman ruins, expanding them and then branding the entire structure as new. But in doing so, they created the illusion of a seamless history. For many historians, this raises an uncomfortable question. How much of medieval Europe's architectural heritage is truly original, and how much is a rebranded legacy from a deeper, forgotten past? The truth is even harder to uncover when 19th and 20th century restoration records are found to have missing pages or have been left suspiciously incomplete. Skeptics say this soft editing of history isn't a conspiracy, but a matter of narrative convenience, a desire to craft a simplified story that is easier to link to national pride or religious authority. But in that convenient simplicity, a vast gray zone of memory has emerged, where bricks 1,000 years older than the wall they support are still labeled 12th century, just to fit the plaque on the gate. And when independent researchers suggest that some structures may predate their official labels by a full millennium, the only response they often get is silence. From the stone walls of Europe, where timelines may have been quietly adjusted, we now return eastward to a culture famed for its meticulous record-keeping, Imperial China. The Song dynasty, which ruled from the 10th to the 13th centuries, left behind some of the most extensive historical archives in the world. But buried within these official chronicles are subtle signs of revision, suggesting that even the most detailed histories can be strategically edited to serve a political purpose. During the Song era, court historians were tasked with recording every daily event, from military campaigns to imperial edicts. Their work became the definitive reference for future generations. What is less known is that these texts underwent at least 2 major rounds of revision, each tightly controlled by the emperor. The first wave of editing began as soon as the dynasty consolidated power, with the goal of justifying its rule. Events were reinterpreted, rivals were recast as villains, and the Song court was portrayed as the sole force of order in a chaotic world. The second major revision occurred after the Song dynasty fell to the Mongols. The new Yuan dynasty formed a committee of historians to produce the final, official history of the Song. It is a detailed and voluminous work, but 20th century scholars noted numerous oddities. Key political figures inexplicably vanish from the timeline, and major events are reduced to a single, vague sentence. One notable case involves a high-ranking official who, according to contemporary accounts, was wrongly accused of treason but later exonerated. In the official history written by the conquerors, that exoneration never appears, leaving only the image of a disgraced official. Why? Perhaps the new regime had no interest in honoring a figure aligned with the old dynasty's ideals. Another example is the disappearance of documents related to secret diplomatic negotiations between the Song and their rivals. Though cited in earlier records, these primary sources vanish from the final history, replaced by second-hand summaries. Historians suspect the editors sought to suppress any memory of concessions that might have sparked unrest in the newly conquered territories. What is striking is that many modern academics still treat this official history as authoritative, citing its coherence. But that very cohesion is a red flag. When a fallen dynasty's history is written by its conquerors, where is the line between recording the truth and rewriting it for political gain? Can we be certain that these records reflect what truly happened, or are they a carefully crafted story, designed to smooth over contradictions and prevent future generations from ever asking what lies beneath the polished surface? If the Song dynasty chronicles show how victors can reshape the past, ancient Egypt offers a different kind of erasure, one where a powerful ruler was deliberately expunged from memory by his own people, and where the original documents about his reign remain sealed in archives to this day. Over 3,000 years ago, the pharaoh Akhenaten launched one of the most radical religious revolutions in history. He declared that the solar disk, the Aten, was the one true God, challenging the immense power of the traditional priesthood of Ammonius. He built a new capital city, Akhetaten, and transformed Egyptian art, ritual, and record-keeping. But after his death, the old order moved swiftly to perform a damnatio memoriae, a formal condemnation and erasure of his memory. His name was chiseled from temple walls, his statues were smashed, and in later king lists he was referred to only as the criminal. Yet despite this campaign of destruction, many original records from his reign, letters, decrees, and internal reports, were not destroyed, but sealed away in temple archives and tombs. In the 19th century, archaeologists began excavating at his lost capital and uncovered thousands of clay tablets, known as the Amarna letters. These texts revealed a fragile empire struggling to maintain control, while its royal court was consumed by religious upheaval. But the majority of these materials, including lists of tribute and internal memos, remain unpublished, stored away in the archives of the Cairo Museum, the British Museum, and private collections. Modern scholars have asked a simple but profound question: why, after more than a century, have so few of these primary records been fully released? The official explanations, lack of qualified translators, preservation concerns, ring hollow for some. They suspect a deeper motive, that if the full Amarna archive were unveiled, Akhenaten might emerge not as a mere heretic, but as a political reformer who threatened the economic and spiritual monopoly of the priesthood, a truth that subsequent dynasties had no interest in remembering. Another layer of mystery involves unreleased tablets said to detail the succession after Akhenaten, including the true relationship between Tutankhamun and the powerful Queen Nefertiti. Proving or disproving these connections would not just alter academic timelines. It could impact modern claims of heritage and the status of the very institutions that manage Egypt's antiquities. To this day, access to the Amarna archives remains severely restricted. Among archaeologists, a half-joking phrase circulates: Amarna is always open, she just never invites you in today, as tourists crowd around the golden mask of Tutankhamun. Few realize that just a short distance away, crates containing the story of his controversial father have sat collecting dust for a century. And the quietest question of all is this: if one day the Amarna tablets are fully translated, how many chapters of Egyptian history, long assumed to be true, will have to be rewritten from scratch? If the sealed Amarna archives show how power can erase a king, medieval Europe reveals how an institution can become the ultimate gatekeeper of all knowledge. From the 4th century onward, as Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the Church began to construct a vast system of intellectual control that extended far beyond theology, asserting its authority over history, science, and philosophy. By the Middle Ages, cathedral schools and the first universities had become the exclusive centers for educating the continent's elite. While this system preserved much of the classical legacy, it also created an unprecedented filter on ideas. Any text deemed incompatible with church doctrine was subject to revision, suppression, or outright destruction. A prime example is Origen, a 3rd century Christian theologian whose radical ideas included the pre-existence of the soul and the ultimate salvation of all beings. By the 6th century, he was condemned as a heretic, and his writings were systematically purged from libraries, surviving only in fragmented citations. Similarly, as Greek medical knowledge was translated, the Church demanded rigorous censorship. Passages that contradicted the idea of a soul governing the body or that suggested disease arose from natural causes were often removed. By the 13th century, this control reached its zenith. The Pope issued decrees requiring all universities to follow an official curriculum, and unapproved philosophical texts were banned. In 1210, the Council of Paris declared that no one shall teach the natural philosophy of Aristotle. Though these restrictions eventually loosened, they left a deep mark. All knowledge had to be sanctioned by divine authority. Thinkers who pushed the boundaries, like Roger Bacon, were closely monitored and sometimes placed under house arrest. In 1559, a more formal mechanism of control was introduced, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of prohibited books, which would last for 4 centuries. It banned any work deemed a threat to orthodoxy, blacklisting figures like Copernicus, Galileo, and Spinoza. Mere possession of these books could lead to confiscation of property or even execution. To be fair, monastic scriptoria also painstakingly preserved thousands of texts that might otherwise have been lost. But the essential question remains: did this monopoly on knowledge also ensure that only a sanitized, controlled version of that legacy was passed on? Today, when we examine a 1,000-year-old manuscript in the Vatican Library, it is nearly impossible to tell if it is an original or a subtle revision. For centuries, the Church held the power to define truth. And perhaps the most sobering question is this: if every story had to pass through that gate before reaching the light of day, are we truly reading history, or just a version someone believed we were allowed to know? If the Church's control over education shaped the mind of medieval Europe, then the Vatican's secret archives, now formally known as the Vatican Apostolic Archive, represent the pinnacle of silent authority. This is a vast, sealed chronicle of centuries, hidden behind doors that few have ever been permitted to open. Located within the Vatican, the archive contains nearly 55 miles of shelving, holding a staggering collection of diplomatic correspondence, papal decrees, inquisitorial trial transcripts, and secret letters between popes and monarchs dating back to the 8th century. It sounds like a historian's dream, but for most of its existence, this archive was entirely off-limits. The term secretum, in its original Latin, meant private, but the tradition of extreme restriction turned the archive into a legend, a vault of hidden histories that could reshape our understanding of the world. Only in 1881 did the Pope begin to allow limited access to scholars, but even today, the process is incredibly strict. Only a small number of researchers are granted entry each year. They must have extensive academic credentials, and browsing is forbidden. They can only request a few documents at a time, and their handwritten notes are often reviewed before they leave. Those who have entered describe it as a ritualistic experience of long, silent corridors and heavy iron doors. Within those shelves lie documents rumored to contain explosive information. The full transcripts of Galileo's trial, revealing not just a clash of science and faith, but of deeper political schemes. The complete records of the trials that dismantled the Knights Templar, and confidential letters from kings and queens containing plans never told in textbooks. In 2003, the Vatican released a portion of the Templar records, perhaps to quell speculation. But this controlled disclosure only intensified curiosity. If there is nothing to hide, why do nearly 55 miles of shelves remain inaccessible? Supporters of the secrecy argue it is necessary to protect sensitive documents from misinterpretation or loss. But critics ask a sharper question. When the largest archive in Christendom opens only a narrow slit, who gets to control history's narrative? Could our entire understanding of the Renaissance or the Enlightenment be shaped more by what has been withheld than by what has been revealed? Today, the Vatican archives remain a mythic labyrinth of memory, where letters centuries old sit in silence. And the final, haunting question still hangs in the air. If the entirety of those archives were ever unveiled, what parts of human history would we be forced to rewrite? If the Vatican's archives symbolize the power to hide knowledge, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, represent a more subtle form of control, the ability to shape how knowledge is interpreted from the very beginning. Founded in 1540 during the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits quickly recognized that to reclaim the Church's influence, they needed a new strategy. They had to infiltrate the roots of knowledge itself, the schools and universities where future leaders were formed. Within decades, the Jesuits had established hundreds of colleges across Europe and its colonies, becoming the dominant educational path for the Catholic elite. These schools taught not just theology, but classics, mathematics, and science. What made the Jesuits so effective was their ability to combine outward intellectual openness with strict internal discipline. In a Jesuit classroom, a student could discuss Copernicus, but only as a mathematical hypothesis, never as a physical reality that challenged the Earth's central place in God's creation. The Jesuits maintained firm control through their official guide to education, the Ratio Studiorum. This detailed document prescribed which texts could be taught, which passages had to be omitted, and how to interpret them in ways that would not provoke religious doubt. Thinkers like Descartes could be quoted, but only insofar as their ideas were framed as servants of faith. On the one hand, the Jesuits preserved a vast amount of classical knowledge that might have otherwise been lost. But on the other, many historians question whether their strict oversight ensured that the Western mind would never stray too far from ecclesiastical authority. This educational strategy endured for centuries, shaping the worldview of Europe's most influential figures. They emerged with a preformed understanding. Science and reason were valuable, but only when kept beneath a metaphysical ceiling enforced by the Church. Today, the Jesuits are often admired for their academic rigor. But quietly, scholars still wonder, when an institution is at once a missionary, a censor, and a teacher, can knowledge ever be truly free of intent? Like the Vatican archives, the silent influence of Jesuit curricula reminds us that the most effective form of knowledge suppression may not be what is forbidden, but what is permitted only within boundaries drawn by those who rule the narrative. After centuries of education shaped by the Church, the Age of Enlightenment seemed to usher in a new era where reason and science would define reality. But even in our modern world, a quiet question remains. Have the deeper, symbolic meanings of ancient knowledge been deliberately erased, leaving only their technical shells? The concept of sacred geometry, the belief that the universe is designed according to geometric principles, exists in nearly every ancient civilization. The Egyptians built their pyramids using the golden ratio. The Greeks designed the Parthenon with precise harmonic proportions, and Indian mandalas were mapped as expressions of cosmic order. In these traditions, circles, spirals, and stars were not just tools for construction. They were metaphors for the link between spirit and matter. But as modern science advanced, geometry was severed from its philosophical context. In today's textbooks, it is distilled into a set of rigid definitions and formulas. Symbols like the flower of life or Metatron's cube have been relegated to the margins of mysticism, with no place in a standard curriculum. Some researchers argue this separation was not just academic. It was a deliberate desacralization of knowledge, stripping symbols of their power to tell stories and reducing them to soulless math problems. In an era of extreme rationalism, anyone who referenced the symbolic dimensions of form was easily dismissed as unscientific. Consider the flower of life, found etched on temple walls in Egypt, on Renaissance tombstones, and in Islamic mosaics. For millennia, it was recognized as a symbol of the interconnectedness of all life. But as this idea became inconvenient to materialist narratives, textbooks quietly phased out any metaphysical interpretation. Or take the pentagram. To the Pythagoreans, it represented health and the divine harmony of the cosmos. By the Middle Ages, it was denounced by the Church as a symbol of magic. And in modern times, to avoid controversy, textbooks refer to it only as a five-pointed shape used to teach angles, ignoring its rich philosophical roots. Some say this is just the natural result of academic specialization. But it raises a deeper question. By erasing the sacred layer of meaning, have we lost a part of our own civilizational memory? For our ancestors, geometry was a language to express what words could not. Today, when we open a geometry textbook, we see diagrams and formulas, but we see few explanations for why these shapes once mattered so deeply. And perhaps this is the quietest loss of all. When knowledge becomes purely technical, it loses its soul, its ability to inspire awe and connect us to the world in a meaningful way. If the distortion of sacred geometry reduced ancient symbols to soulless diagrams, the story of Mesopotamian archaeology reveals a different kind of manipulation, one where language itself was retranslated and reinterpreted to fit existing assumptions. When 19th-century European archaeologists first unearthed the ruins of Sumer and Akkad, they discovered a massive library of cuneiform texts. These clay tablets contained everything from legal codes to cosmic myths, shattering the long-held belief that civilization began with Egypt and Greece. But because these findings were so foundational, the translation of cuneiform quickly became a battleground for ideological control. Early scholars, particularly in Britain and France, were often pressured to shape their translations to align with biblical narratives. Sensitive passages that clashed with prevailing religious views were softened, omitted, or reworded. A clear example is the Epic of Atrahasis, a Sumerian flood myth that predates and mirrors the story of Noah. The first English translation selectively included only the non-controversial parts, leaving out key moments, such as the god Enlil expressing remorse for wiping out humanity. The idea that a god could be fallible was too theologically unsettling for the time. Similarly, early translations of Sumerian legal codes were often tailored to emphasize their similarities to the Old Testament, reinforcing biblical authority. Crucial differences, such as the emphasis on restorative justice rather than punishment, were downplayed. Another case is the Sumerian king list, which describes dynasties ruling for tens of thousands of years. In early editions, scholars simply corrected these timelines, changing 28,800 years to 288 years to avoid conflicting with biblical chronologies. And here lies the deeper issue. These filtered translations went on to shape how modern education presents Mesopotamian civilization. When an ancient culture is viewed only through the lens of a later one, our ability to understand it on its own terms is profoundly limited. Later generations of scholars have worked to correct these biases, but ironically, the more accurate versions rarely make it into standard textbooks, which favor the older, simplified editions that are easier to teach and less likely to provoke controversy. And so, anyone interested in the true voice of Sumer and Akkad must wade through dense academic papers, seeking a civilization that was often stranger, more sophisticated, and more nuanced than our modern frameworks are prepared to acknowledge. If the mistranslation of Sumerian texts shows how knowledge can be shaped at the level of language, the story of out-of-sequence archaeological discoveries reveals a deeper fear that science itself can punish those who question its foundational assumptions. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, a number of archaeologists and geologists published shocking findings. Sophisticated tools, human traces, or signs of civilization appearing in geological layers far too old for them to have existed according to accepted timelines. These announcements didn't just stir debate, they often destroyed careers. One of the most infamous cases is that of Dr. Virginia C. McIntyre, an American geologist who, in the 1960s, was part of a team that dated a site in Mexico with advanced stone tools to approximately 250,000 years ago, long before modern humans were thought to exist. The team's data was solid, derived from multiple dating methods. But the backlash was swift and brutal. Experts dismissed the findings as flawed without re-examining them. When Steve McIntyre stood by her data, she was blacklisted. Scientific journals refused to publish her work. Her teaching contracts were terminated, and she was never able to secure a permanent research position again. She later wrote, "I wasn't rejected for weak data. I was rejected because my data didn't fit the story they wanted to preserve." Another case is that of Thomas Lee, a Canadian archaeologist who, in the 1950s, excavated artifacts suggesting human presence in North America tens of thousands of years earlier than the accepted theory allowed. When he refused to back down from his findings, the museum that employed him cut his funding, removed his collection from public display, and ultimately dismissed him. Then there's the work of Michael Cremo, who has spent years documenting hundreds of such cases from forgotten archaeological reports, discoveries that were removed from public archives simply for being out of sequence. To be clear, science rightly demands rigorous standards of evidence. But the paradox is this: extraordinary data is often excluded before it can even be properly scrutinized, discarded not for its poor quality, but for being too disruptive. When such findings are mentioned today, they're typically labeled fringe theories, unworthy of serious discussion. But independent researchers continue to ask, if the claims are so obviously wrong, why not refute them with transparent reanalysis? Why is the response so often defunding, professional exile, and silence? The answer is elusive, but it may lie in the simple inertia of knowledge. Once a theoretical framework is built, any contradictory data is seen not as a new discovery, but as a threat. And so, the void left by these rejected findings becomes fertile ground for legends. Legends of lost civilizations, of ancient humans more advanced than we imagined, or simply of a science that, while seeking truth, still fears the data that doesn't fit its own frame. If out-of-sequence discoveries can derail a career, then within the polished halls of international academic conferences, the gatekeeping is more discreet. Here, censorship doesn't require a formal ban. It often arrives in a single, polite phrase. Conflicts with the research direction, academic conferences are critical platforms for sharing new discoveries. But there are also places where certain topics quietly vanish from the program, especially if they challenge accepted historical frameworks. One well-known case occurred at a conference on Göbekli Tepe, the 12,000-year-old megalithic site. A group of young archaeologists submitted a paper questioning whether the site was not just ritualistic, but also had a sophisticated astronomical function, implying a level of societal organization far beyond what is expected of hunter-gatherers. Their proposal was initially accepted, but just weeks before the event, it was quietly pulled. The vague reason given was that it lacked academic maturity, a polite euphemism for being too controversial. A similar pattern emerged at a North American prehistory conference, where an independent archaeologist attempted to present findings suggesting human activity dating back 50,000 years. The paper passed early peer review, but when several influential funders objected, the organizing committee removed it. Citing a lack of consensus behind closed doors, colleagues advised the researcher to accept the quiet withdrawal rather than cause a scene. This polite system of exclusion is often defended as a pragmatic measure, a shield against media sensationalism and pseudoscience. But critics ask, if controversial data is always delayed or omitted, how can the scientific community ever evaluate it transparently? As a result, many such topics remain buried in obscure journals or internal reports. Theories about much older human origins, prehistoric transoceanic trade, or advanced astronomical knowledge are quietly relegated to the fringes. And in that space, a question continues to grow. How many discoveries have been blocked, not because they were wrong, but because they risked shaking the historical scaffolding we have all come to rely on? Today, as we browse the sleek programs of modern conferences, filled with hundreds of safe papers, few pause to wonder what might be missing. Somewhere beyond the printed schedule, there may exist a second, invisible list, the topics that were quietly crossed out before they could ever be brought to light. If sensitive topics are often removed from conferences, sometimes the story becomes even more dramatic when the physical artifacts themselves vanish, leaving behind a void with no official explanation. Among the most baffling cases is the mysterious disappearance of 13 crates of Inca and pre-Inca artifacts, lost somewhere between Peru and Europe in the early 20th century. The story began in 1926, when a joint Peruvian and French expedition excavated a site in the Ayacucho region of Peru. Over 4 months, they collected hundreds of priceless objects, gold masks, ceramic plates with strange symbols, and stone statues depicting figures with unfamiliar headdresses. Some of these items bore artistic styles that were foreign to known Inca or Wari designs, resembling carvings seen in Polynesian or even Mesoamerican cultures, a detail that would later fuel intense speculation. According to official records, the artifacts were sealed into 13 wooden crates, inspected, and signed off by both Peruvian and French officials. The shipment was intended for Paris, where the artifacts were to be studied and restored before half were returned to a museum in Lima. In August 1927, the cargo ship departed from Peru, bound for France. But when the ship arrived, the 13 crates were missing. The shipping company claimed the cargo had been unloaded at an unscheduled port, but never specified which one. Because the shipment was state-owned, no private party could file a claim. And after a brief, formal request for an investigation, the matter quietly faded from the record. What makes the disappearance so suspicious is not just the scale. 13 sealed crates do not simply vanish, but the nature of the contents. Sketches made before packing showed stone figures resembling ancient ships, a disc engraved with a coastal map that did not match traditional Inca geography, and gold masks in a style never before seen in Peru. Theories abound. Some suspect the crates were stolen and sold to wealthy collectors. Others believe it was an intentional cover-up to eliminate artifacts that could raise troubling questions about early transoceanic contact, a theory fiercely rejected by mainstream historians. All attempts to track the shipment have led to dead ends. In the 1950s, a journalist discovered that all cargo records from the port of Le Havre for that year had been lost during World War II. The museums involved also claimed to no longer have any relevant receipts. The complete disappearance of the 13 crates has turned the story into little more than a historical anecdote. But it raises uncomfortable questions. Who decides which evidence is preserved and which accidentally vanishes in transit? History doesn't always disappear in a great fire. Sometimes it just disappears in silence, shaped by the hands that control the flow of heritage. If the disappearance of 13 crates of artifacts exposed a mysterious break in the chain of evidence, the story of the Smithsonian Institution, America's largest museum complex, reveals a more subtle form of control, the quiet filtering of records and the steering of public narrative towards safe conclusions. Founded with the mission to increase and diffuse knowledge, the Smithsonian has long been a trusted authority. Yet, throughout the 20th century, a number of researchers began to ask why so many well-documented but anomalous archaeological findings were never published or, worse, seemed to vanish from the public record. One of the most persistent examples involves the so-called giant skeletons between the 1880s and 1920s. Numerous excavation teams reported finding human remains over 8 feet tall. Preliminary reports appeared in scientific journals, and some remains were sent to the Smithsonian for study. But by the 1930s, the detailed records of these finds began to disappear. When a private archaeological group requested access to the remains in the 1940s, the Smithsonian responded that no such records existed. When questioned by Congress, representatives denied any policy of suppression but could not explain why so many case files were missing. Another story surrounds the Lovelock Cave site in Nevada, where anthropologists noted that some of the ancient skulls displayed unusual features not aligned with known indigenous populations. By the 1950s, most of these artifacts had been removed from public exhibits, and the original studies now exist only as obscure citations. The Smithsonian was also suspected of filtering radiocarbon dates from sites that suggested unexpectedly early human activity. During this period, the Clovis First theory, which held that humans entered the Americas no earlier than 13,000 years ago, was the dominant paradigm. Findings that returned much older dates were often dismissed as contaminated samples and quietly dropped from publication. Some historians argue this was not a conspiracy, but a form of institutional self-defense. When evidence contradicts a dominant theory, researchers risk losing credibility and funding. The pressure often leads to a file and forget approach. But the result is a shadow zone in American archaeology where dozens of anomalous findings were never properly vetted or debated. All that remains are vague ledger entries or secondhand recollections. Today, the Smithsonian remains a globally respected institution. But behind its pristine displays lie storerooms that only a select few can access, and perhaps case files deemed too complicated for public release. And the real question isn't whether one particular theory is correct, but rather, when silent censorship becomes habitual, how can we ever know what truths were excluded simply because they didn't fit the version of history we were prepared to accept? If archaeological records could be recalled and sealed, then in the 20th century, a more modern form of censorship emerged. Documentary films that vanished from national archives because they touched on topics too sensitive to confront. From the dawn of cinema, documentary has been a powerful tool for preserving memory. National repositories in the US, UK, and France stored thousands of reels showing archaeological digs, scientific conferences, and interviews with eyewitnesses to history. But over time, certain films began to disappear or become restricted, not because they were damaged, but because they revealed things that were outside the comfort zone of official narratives. One case involves a film documenting early excavations at Teotihuacan, Mexico. The footage showed murals and carvings visibly distinct from later Aztec styles, hinting that the city may have been built by an even older culture. Initially housed in the Library of Congress, the film was quietly labeled restricted in the 1950s. When Archaeology magazine requested access in the 1970s, they were told the film was temporarily withdrawn for content review. That status has not changed. A similar story comes from the UK, where a 1936 film documented surveys of ancient earthworks. The footage included a scene where archaeologists uncovered Roman-style brickwork beneath layers dated to the Bronze Age. After being screened publicly, the film was later removed from the archives, with the stated reason being unverified accuracy in the U.S. The National Archaeological Archive once held footage from excavations where stone tools were found in layers deemed far too ancient for the prevailing Clovis first theory. After limited test screenings, the film vanished from public circulation. Some argue these removals are not malice, but caution, a way to prevent sensationalism from undermining public trust in academia. But others push back. If the public only sees pre-approved, safe narratives, then silence itself becomes the breeding ground for conspiracy. To this day, restricted film catalogs exist in national repositories around the world. Official reasons range from historical sensitivity to lack of scientific consensus, but without transparency, we will never know what these films truly contain or why they were locked away. And perhaps the greatest irony is this. We live in a digital age of supposed open access, yet entire visual records of our past remain in sealed vaults. Their contents hidden not by decay, but by a quiet decision that they were too inconvenient for us to see. When we speak of historical fragments deemed too sensitive, few artifacts have stirred as much debate as the Pyrie Reis map, a 500-year-old piece of gazelle skin that seems to defy the conventional history of cartography. Pyrie Reis, an admiral of the Ottoman Navy, drew the map in 1513, using a variety of older source maps. At first glance, it resembles a typical 16th century chart, but what has kept it at the center of controversy is its southern section, a depiction of a landmass that stretches beyond South America, bearing a striking resemblance to the coastline of Antarctica. According to accepted history, Antarctica wasn't discovered until 1820. Yet Pyrie Reis not only showed its existence, but illustrated its coastal contour with uncanny accuracy, particularly the landmass of Queen Maud Land. Proponents of an ancient law school of cartography argue that the map depicts this coastline as it would have looked before it was covered in ice, suggesting it was based on sources from a much older, forgotten time. Mainstream academia, however, has long met such claims with extreme caution. For decades, institutions have classified this portion of the map as imaginative embellishment, a common Renaissance habit of filling in unknown regions. This interpretation made its way into textbooks, effectively neutralizing the map's provocative implications by celebrating it as a curious blend of fact and fantasy. Yet, not all scholars agreed. Charles Hapgood, a historian of science, argued in his 1966 book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, that the projection techniques used in the map were far too advanced for the 1500s. He even consulted with the U.S. Air Force, which reportedly confirmed similarities between the map and modern subglacial topography. Despite this, Hapgood's work was largely dismissed by mainstream history departments. The debate was co-opted by fringe theorists, and serious inquiry all but ceased. As a result, the public is rarely exposed to the full controversy. Was the map simply a clever fusion of known coastlines and artistic license, or is it a clue to a body of maritime knowledge that was once global and was later lost? Today, the Pyrie Reis map remains behind glass in Istanbul, muted by layers of explanation. Visitors admire the ancient drawings but leave with a neatly packaged story, a beautiful map but ultimately inaccurate. And perhaps that quiet dismissal is the most telling part of all. Sometimes the easiest way to neutralize an inconvenient artifact isn't to destroy it, but simply to relabel it as art and let time do the rest. If the Pyrie Reis map hints at a forgotten maritime knowledge, the story of ancient Polynesian navigation makes an even bolder point, that we have silently narrowed our collective memory of seafaring to fit the narrative that global discovery was a European invention. For centuries, Polynesians crossed the vast Pacific Ocean in massive double-hulled canoes, traveling thousands of kilometers of open sea without compasses or paper charts. They relied instead on sophisticated mental maps, memorizing star paths, wave patterns, and the flight of birds. These routes were passed down through generations of oral tradition. When European explorers like Captain Cook arrived in the Pacific, they were stunned by the locals' navigational precision. Cook himself wrote that they drew charts in the sand more intricate than any sea map he carried. What is rarely acknowledged today is that many early European expeditions meticulously documented these native routes, using them for their own trade and military voyages. In the naval archives of Britain, France, and Spain, handwritten logs described anchoring points and wind patterns shared by Polynesian navigators. Some records even note that European captains hired local wayfinders to guide their journeys. Yet by the 19th century, as European empires sought to claim the sole prestige of maritime discovery, these native routes quietly vanished from official naval manuals. Routes that had once been considered valid maritime data were reclassified as ethnographic notes. Why were they removed? Some argue it was a natural result of standardization, as European navies adopted modern instruments. But others, like the author David Lewis, argue it was a deeper dismissal of indigenous knowledge because it didn't align with the story of Europe as the sole discoverer of the world. In the 20th century, Polynesian navigators began to reconstruct these ancient routes. The most famous voyage was that of the Hkali, which sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti in 1976, guided only by traditional methods. Its success forced the world to admit that these so-called mythic skills were real and astonishingly accurate. Today, many of the hand-drawn maps once dismissed as folklore are being digitized, though few people realize that for over a century, they were treated as legitimate navigational records until they were quietly removed from mainstream history to preserve the myth of Western maritime supremacy. And perhaps the most sobering thought is this: when a people leave no written records, their knowledge is easily discounted, even if that knowledge once carried them halfway across the planet, long before Europeans knew how vast the world truly was. If the disappearance of Polynesian sea routes reflects a dismissal of indigenous knowledge, this next story carries even more weight. The hypothesis that African sailors may have reached the Americas long before Columbus, once discussed in early 20th century academic literature, has since been pushed to the absolute margins of history. For decades, the mainstream narrative has rested on the idea that Columbus was the first to connect the Old and New worlds. Yet, scattered across Central and South America are puzzling traces: stone carvings with unfamiliar facial features, unusual metal alloys, and the remains of plants not native to the Americas. One of the first scholars to raise this issue was Leo Wiener, a Harvard linguist who, in the 1920s, argued that certain agricultural techniques in Mexico and Peru bore remarkable similarities to West African methods. Though his work was initially regarded as serious scholarship, it was eventually dismissed as coincidental. In the 1970s, the historian Ivan van Sertima reignited the debate with his controversial book, They Came Before Columbus. He went further, claiming that the colossal Olmec stone heads, with their broad noses and full lips, were portraits of contact with West African sailors in the 13th or 14th centuries. He cited Spanish colonial records in which explorers described seeing dark-skinned people along the Panamanian coast. But from that point on, the theory met with intense and organized resistance. Academic institutions labeled it fringe scholarship, and by the 1980s, American history textbooks had almost entirely removed any mention of possible pre-Columbian African contact. The Olmec heads were reinterpreted as stylized depictions of local rulers. The irony is that some aspects of the argument were never fully debunked. For example, the presence of Old World cotton species in pre-Columbian archaeological layers remains a botanical mystery. Yet, such data is excluded from mainstream textbooks due to a lack of consensus at major archaeological conferences. Proposals on this topic have been repeatedly declined, usually to avoid unnecessary political or racial controversy. But in doing so, the public is denied access to an open scholarly debate. Today, this theory is largely absent from official curricula. The Olmec heads remain on quiet display in museums, labeled simply distinctive artistic style. And perhaps this is the most uncomfortable question of all. When a hypothesis doesn't fit the standardized Eurocentric story of discovery, is it ever truly given a fair hearing? Or is it quietly excluded because it forces us to redefine who arrived first? If pre-Columbian voyages challenge our narrative of first contact, then Puma Punku, a megalithic ruin on Bolivia's high plateau, poses a different kind of riddle. How did a civilization with no known written language produce stonework so precise that even modern engineers struggle to explain it? Part of the larger Tiwanaku archaeological site, Puma Punku consists of enormous sandstone and diorite blocks, some weighing tens of tons, carved with mirror-smooth finishes and perfectly drilled holes. Many of the iconic H-shaped stones feature surfaces that are flat to within a fraction of a millimeter, a level of precision that leaves modern stonemasons astonished. The first major studies of the site were conducted by Arthur Poznański in the early 20th century. After decades of measurement, he concluded that Puma Punku might be over 15,000 years old, an estimate that drew fierce opposition from his contemporaries. After his death, his research was scattered and never published in full. In the 1950s, new excavation teams returned to the area, while radiocarbon dating of nearby agricultural layers suggested a more conservative age of around 1,500 years. No serious investigation into how the stones were shaped was ever pursued. By the end of the 20th century, despite the blocks remaining fully exposed and accessible, official excavation at Puma Punku had largely ceased. A lingering question remains: why has a full survey using modern tools like laser scanning never been organized? Independent researchers and engineers have conducted their own small-scale surveys, suggesting that shaping diorite, one of the hardest stones on Earth, to this level of precision requires techniques far beyond simple hammer and chisel. Yet, proposals for formal research funding are almost always rejected, with the stated reason being a lack of theoretical framework. Some academics argue that limited budgets should be prioritized for sites with written records. But others find this rationale insufficient, especially since Puma Punku's stones sit right on the surface, requiring no deep excavation. That very convenience, critics argue, makes the silence even more suspicious. Today, when tourists visit Puma Punku, local guides mention the Great Tiwanaku civilization but quickly move on. There is no exhibit on stone shaping techniques, no discussion of how blocks weighing over 100 tons were moved across the high-altitude terrain. A single sign reads Puma Punku, circa 5th to 10th century CE, and nothing more. There, in the thin air of the Andes, the stones remain massive, immobile, and eerily precise. And when research teams decline to return, and when modern surveys are indefinitely postponed, silence itself becomes a form of soft censorship. What makes Puma Punku so extraordinary may not be just the stones, but the way it reveals how even science can flinch in the face of what it cannot easily explain, choosing instead to look away. If Puma Punku raises uncomfortable questions about ancient technology, the story of the Olmec civilization's origins reveals a different kind of discomfort, a reluctance to acknowledge that pre-Columbian history may be far more complex than the tidy narrative of isolated development. The Olmec, who emerged around 1500 BCE, are widely considered the mother civilization of Mesoamerica. They left behind pyramids, an early writing system, and most iconically, a series of colossal stone heads whose facial features have sparked debate for over a century. Found at sites like La Venta and San Lorenzo, these giant heads display broad noses, full lips, and other traits distinctly different from the stylized faces seen in later Mesoamerican art. Early observers, including the American archaeologist who led the first major excavations in the 1930s, remarked on their non-native features and noted a resemblance to West African morphology, though he stopped short of drawing any firm conclusions. By the 1960s and 70s, some scholars openly proposed that the heads were stone-carved memories of transatlantic contact. But this also marked the beginning of a strong and organized pushback. By the 1980s, mainstream academic institutions began reframing the Olmec heads in textbooks and museum exhibits. Where once some scholars had cautiously suggested an African resemblance, newer interpretations emphasized stylized aesthetics, calling the heads idealized depictions of local rulers. While this interpretation is not without merit, no direct DNA evidence has linked the Olmec to Africa. What concerns many independent researchers is not the debate itself, but how the topic has been quietly removed from public discourse rather than being critically evaluated. In the 1990s, an international conference planned a panel on the possibility of transoceanic contact, but it was canceled just months before the event, with organizers citing the need to avoid racially charged controversy. The topic vanished from the official proceedings. Even today, museums are cautious, offering neutral interpretations like an elite stylistic tradition to avoid the deeper implications. The question lingers: why do these heads bear such unmistakably distinct features? The academic silence may not stem from a conspiracy, but from a post-colonial hypersensitivity around race. Scholars fear being misinterpreted or aligned with political extremism. And so, rather than risk controversy, the field often opts for silence. Yet that silence may be the most dangerous space of all, for when debate is shut down entirely, the truth, whatever it may be, becomes fertile ground for myth and polarization. If the Olmec heads challenged archaeologists with unfamiliar faces, then the story of certain ancient Chinese world maps reveals something even more unsettling. That global geographical knowledge may have been far more advanced in China, long before Europe's age of discovery, yet was quietly shelved and sealed away for centuries. Among the most debated examples is a large, hand-painted silk scroll known as the Qianlong Global Map, believed to have been completed in the early Qing dynasty around 1763. While it portrays Asia, Europe, and Africa with surprising accuracy, it is its depiction of the American coastlines and even islands resembling Polynesia and New Zealand that has puzzled researchers. This map was not unique. Other versions circulated in limited court circles, showing America labeled as the Great Western Continent and the southern polar region marked as White Lands, a place of eternal snow. In the 19th century, some Western scholars dismissed these maps as hybrids, inspired by Jesuit knowledge introduced to China. But several details didn't align with European maps of the time. Notably, the Chinese maps showed a continuous west coast of the Americas, while European maps still treated California as a potential island. Whatever their origins, one fact stands out. From the late 18th century, the Qing court ordered these maps to be sealed, labeling them imperial property and strictly forbidding their reproduction. An imperial edict instructed the government to catalog over 200 sensitive maps, citing concerns about revealing strategic territories to outsiders. When the Qing dynasty collapsed, many of these maps were lost or sold abroad, and now sit in private collections. What's striking is how, as European maritime dominance grew, these Chinese maps disappeared from the official narrative of world history. In our textbooks, Asian geography was reduced to being insular, while Columbus and Magellan became the unchallenged heroes of global exploration. It was not until the late 20th century that popular attention was brought back to the idea that Chinese explorers may have mapped more of the world than previously thought. While many historians have rejected the more sensational claims, they acknowledge a crucial point. The Qing government's deliberate censorship of its own geographic data suggests a nervousness, as if the maps revealed too much to be left unguarded. Today, within the Forbidden Cities archives in Beijing, some of these ancient maps still exist, rarely digitized and rarely studied. And perhaps the deeper question is not whether the maps are accurate, but who decides whether a civilization's far-reaching vision of the world deserves to be remembered. If the Qing dynasty's sealing of maps reflected a fear of knowledge escaping control, then in the modern era, a more sophisticated form of control has emerged: academic gatekeeping. This is a world where invisible networks quietly determine who gets funding, who gets published, and what gets taught. Academia often appears to be an open forum, but behind the scenes, there are entrenched systems of influence. To obtain funding for archaeological or anthropological work, researchers must first align with mainstream scientific directions in practice. This means that if your proposal suggests something too far from accepted models, such as pre-Columbian transoceanic contact or advanced prehistoric technologies, your chances of receiving a grant plummet to near zero. The result is a paradox. Those who attempt bold inquiries must often fund their own work, only to be dismissed for lacking official academic backing. As the archaeologist John Anthony West once stated, "We don't lack evidence. We lack an academic system brave enough to publish it." This soft power also thrives in the editorial boards of major journals, where select few decide what gets published. One journal was accused of rejecting numerous papers on new dating evidence from South America, with an anonymous editor admitting, "We didn't want to reopen a debate the field worked hard to put to rest 50 years ago." Another layer of control lies in university curriculum boards, which determine what gets officially taught. When a U.S. university proposed adding a seminar on pre-Columbian contact, it was vetoed for lacking scholarly consensus. This isn't necessarily a conspiracy. Many of these decisions stem from legitimate caution. But the line between intellectual rigor and suppression is razor thin. Some call it the field's self-defense mechanism. Others are more blunt, describing it as an unnamed guild, a self-replicating network where professors train protégés who then reinforce the same intellectual boundaries. The outcome is clear. Anyone stepping outside the safety line faces professional isolation. Eventually, they are branded as fringe, and perhaps the most chilling truth isn't that some secret society is pulling the strings, but that an unspoken agreement now exists where no one needs to say out loud that certain questions shouldn't be asked and certain truths shouldn't be spoken. If traditional academic gatekeeping relied on controlling funding and publications, the digital age has introduced a new, subtler form of censorship, one built not on overt bans, but on algorithms and invisible editorial policies that quietly shape what the public sees. Many assume that platforms like Wikipedia and Google Scholar are open spaces where all viewpoints coexist. In reality, they enforce stringent editorial hierarchies that can cause controversial topics to nearly vanish from public view. Wikipedia, for example, claims to adhere to a neutral point of view, yet articles flagged as controversial, such as pre-Columbian transoceanic contact or ancient advanced civilizations, are often locked for editing. Control over these entries rests with a small group of administrators who have the power to remove citations or label sections as conspiracy theories, a former senior editor admitted. "There are articles we deliberately structure with bias, not because the content is wrong, but because no one wants Wikipedia associated with fringe culture." Google Scholar, the world's largest academic search engine, uses algorithms that prioritize journal prestige and citation counts. While this sounds reasonable, it creates a monopoly of visibility for mainstream journals, which often avoid controversial hypotheses. Independent research published in smaller journals gets buried in obscurity. Search for a topic like Pumapunku advanced stonework, and Google immediately suggests Pumapunku hoax or ancient aliens, subtly branding all curiosity as false. Even platforms praised for their openness use filtering systems. Content tagged with labels like pseudo-archaeology is quietly deranked or excluded from main feeds. To be fair, these precautions often stem from a legitimate concern about misinformation. But the line between public protection and intellectual manipulation is not always clear. When a handful of editors and algorithm designers decide what appears first or not at all, they effectively control which questions are allowed to be asked. And perhaps the most unsettling question is not whether these platforms are hiding something enormous, but whether now that censorship has shifted from visible hands to invisible code, anyone still dares to ask what piece of the puzzle we are missing. If modern censorship is a product of the digital age, then during the stormy decades of the Cold War, a more discreet mechanism of control evolved, one where intelligence agencies quietly partnered with archaeological expeditions. Following World War II, as the U.S. and the Soviet Union entered into a global confrontation, archaeology suddenly became a strategic tool, a means of accessing sensitive geopolitical zones under the cover of scientific research. Declassified files now reveal that many international dig teams were dual-purpose operations, involved in gathering geographic data, mapping supply routes, and even recruiting local informants. One notable example was Project Mallory, a CIA-backed initiative that ran for 2 decades. Presented publicly as a cultural survey of Central Asia, it allowed Western experts to access areas along the Afghan border, regions then off-limits to most foreigners. While officially framed as Bronze Age research, declassified documents confirmed that these expeditions also collected data for military purposes. In the Soviet Union, archaeology was similarly entangled with geopolitics. Expeditions to Central Asia were designed not only to explore ancient cultures, but also to legitimize Russia's historical dominance in the region. Across the Middle East, many Western archaeological teams received indirect funding from covert agencies. Excavations at Sumerian sites in Iraq during the 1950s and 60s were formally managed by a cultural foundation, but budget records later revealed that up to 60% of the funding came from the U.S. State Department and the CIA. The mission had dual goals: documenting Mesopotamian heritage and monitoring Soviet-aligned political factions. In some cases, this arrangement had benefits, as well-funded digs preserve important sites. But there was a cost. Findings that didn't align with political agendas were often delayed, redacted, or never published. To this day, many archaeological project files from this era remain sealed in the archives of the CIA, MI6, and the GRU. And perhaps the most troubling aspect isn't that archaeology was used for intelligence, but the dangerous precedent it set. When science and political power merge, the boundary between genuine research and strategic propaganda dissolves, leaving behind a historical record that is blurred, distorted, and harder than ever to decipher. From burned libraries and sealed maps to vanished artifacts and censored research, one thing becomes terrifyingly clear. History has never been a fixed monument. It is a living river, its course quietly redirected over centuries by the invisible dams of power, ambition, and fear. When an empire burns the books of its rivals, it is not just destroying parchment, it is committing an act of memory erasure. When an academic board agrees to ignore inconvenient findings, it is not just exercising caution, it is building a wall against independent thought. And when a digital platform labels an uncomfortable idea a conspiracy, it silently appoints itself the gatekeeper of reality. Perhaps the most frightening thing is not the act of forgetting, but the way history is polished and repolished, layered with new coats of narrative varnish until we can no longer distinguish what is evidence from what is merely a convenient echo. In this journey, we have seen the unmistakable patterns. Olmec stone heads bearing faces that challenge our tidy timelines, rebranded as stylized art, ancient world maps suggesting a global knowledge that predates European discovery, sealed away in imperial archives. Archaeological films pulled from public view under the vague label of sensitivity and small, powerful circles in academia and government quietly deciding what gets funded, what gets published, and what gets taught, pushing any inconvenient theory to the margins until it fades into silence. If all of this is true, we must ask ourselves, is the history we are taught built on a foundation of evidence, or on a foundation of consensus? Certainly, not every lost story is a cover-up, and not every radical theory is correct. But not every doubt deserves to be dismissed, either. For it is often in those daring, disruptive questions that history remains a living thing, a vibrant dialogue, not a dead manuscript sealed in a vault. In the end, the most important question is not locked in an archive or buried under the dust of a forgotten ruin. It lies within us. Who gets to decide which stories are told and which memories are preserved? What version of the past will the next generation be commanded to believe. If there is anything truly worth protecting, it is the courage to keep asking, especially when the questions make us uncomfortable. Because history is not dead. It lives in every debate, in every contested piece of evidence, and in every person brave enough to say, I don't know if this is true, but I demand the right to examine it. The past belongs to those who are willing to question it, and the future belongs to those who are brave enough to listen to the answers.